Okay, so today we're diving into supervenience. It's this, well, pretty fundamental idea you find all over philosophy.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it pops up everywhere.
Right. And it basically says something like, there can't be an A difference without a B difference,
Yeah, that's the gist of it.
which, you know, for anyone who's spent any time thinking about philosophy, it's like, whoa, that's a powerful idea.
Mm.
Talk about how things depend on each other, different levels of reality, you know.
Totally. And for this deep dive, we're going right to the source. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on, you guessed it, supervenience.
Solid choice. Always a good starting point.
It's a deep dive into a deep dive, right?
Exactly. And the encyclopedia kicks things off with a really cool example. A perfect forgery of El Greco's view of Toledo.
Oh, yeah, that one's a classic.
So imagine a copy that's not just like visually perfect, but like
Mhm.
molecule for molecule, the same. Yeah. But of course, some things are different, like who made it, how much it's worth, where it's been,
Right.
the history. But the key thing is at the microphysical level.
The nitty-gritty.
Exactly. The arrangement of, like, the pigments. It's identical. So if you want to change the colors, the shapes, anything, you got to mess with that microphysics. And that's basically supervenience in action. The look of the artwork, the colors, the shapes, it all supervenes on the microphysical stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Like a perfect mirror image in one domain means a perfect mirror image in the other.
Right. But the goal of our deep dive is to go way beyond just this basic picture. We're going to, well, first of all, we're going to look at where the term itself comes from.
The history.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then we're going to be really careful to separate it from some other kind of related ideas like grounding and dependence.
Easy to mix those up.
Yeah. But they're actually different beasts. And then we'll get into all the different kinds of supervenience philosophers have come up with. Because it turns out it's not just one thing.
Oh, no, there are flavors.
Right. And we'll see how it's used all over philosophy. From, well, the obvious one, metaphysics,
Of course.
to ethics and everything in between.
Pretty much.
So by the end, you'll have a seriously sharp understanding of supervenience, which, let's be honest, is a pretty handy tool to have in your philosophical toolbox.
Can't argue with that.
All right, so let's start with the word itself, supervenience.
Oh.
I mean, it kind of sounds like a word you'd hear in everyday conversation, right?
Yeah, it's got that everyday vibe, almost like something extra happening, a surprise twist.
Right, like, and then this supervened.
Yeah.
It's an unexpected event. But in philosophy, it's definitely more technical, right?
Totally. Philosophers, they love to take a regular word and give it a precise definition.
So who do we blame for giving supervenience its philosophical makeover?
Well, the history's a bit murky, actually. Some people point to the British emergentists, like Lloyd Morgan back in the early 1900s.
Okay.
He used the term, but more in that everyday sense, something new popping up.
So not quite the precise philosophical meaning we have now.
Right. But later on, R.M. Hare, he used it much closer to how we understand it today, especially in his work on moral properties and their relation to natural properties.
Interesting.
And he even mentioned that it was already being used, like, informally at Oxford back in the 40s, but no one's really sure who coined it first.
Huh. So a bit of a philosophical mystery. But even if the exact origin of the word is unclear, the basic idea has probably been around for a while, right? This idea of some properties depending on others in this specific superveniency way.
Absolutely. The encyclopedia actually points out that philosophers were already making supervenience arguments even before the term caught on.
So like talking the talk before walking the walk.
Exactly. Like, take G.E. Moore. He said, two things can't differ in quality without differing in intrinsic nature. Didn't use the word supervene, but
Okay.
he was definitely getting at the core idea.
Makes sense. So the concept was already out there, just waiting for its fancy label. But is there one philosopher we can like point to as the one who really made supervenience a philosophical star?
Oh, for sure. Donald Davidson. He's the one who really brought supervenience into the big debates in philosophy, especially in philosophy of mind.
Okay.
His idea was that mental stuff depends on, or supervenes on, physical stuff. So you can't have two events that are physically identical but have different mental property.
Right. Yeah.
That really got people thinking. And then you had folks like Horgan, Kim, and Lewis who took that idea and ran with it. They really developed all the different types of supervenience and explored how it applies to different areas.
Okay, so now we've got a sense of where the term came from. Let's go back to that core phrase.
Yeah.
There cannot be a difference without a B difference. I feel like that cannot is doing a lot of work here.
Oh, it's definitely crucial. We're talking about a necessary connection, and just how strong that connection is. Well, that's where the modal force of supervenience comes in.
Modal force.
Yeah. So think of it like this. We've got logical necessity, which is like the strongest kind. It's just straight up contradictory to deny something that's logically necessary. Then there's metaphysical necessity, something that's true in every possible world, even if it's not a matter of pure logic. And then there's nomological necessity, which is tied to the laws of nature in our universe.
Okay, so different levels of cannot.
hmm
But are those different types of necessity, like, equally powerful?
Well, for our purposes, let's say metaphysical and logical necessity are basically on the same level. They both put really strong constraints on what's possible. Nomological necessity, since it's tied to, the laws of our universe, which could have been different, it's generally seen as a bit weaker.
Right, so something could be nomologically necessary in our world, but not in some other crazy hypothetical world with totally different laws of physics.
Exactly.
Okay, so can you give us some examples of supervenience with these different modal forces to see how they play out?
Sure. So take something like the property of being a haircut or a halibut. That supervenes on the disjunctive property of being a haircut and being a halibut. That's metaphysically necessary. If two things are different in whether they're a haircut or a halibut, well, then they have to be different in whether they're a haircut or in whether they're a halibut.
Okay, yeah, I see how that's like a built-in truth.
And for perfect spheres, the surface area supervenes on the volume with metaphysical necessity. No matter what, you can't have two spheres with the same volume but different surface areas. That holds in every possible world.
Got it. Those seem pretty inherently necessary. What about that weaker nomological kind?
Well, there's the Wiedemann-Franz law.
Yeah.
It's this cool relationship between how well metals conduct electricity and heat. They actually go together. Yeah. The law suggests that a change in one forces a change in the other, so they supervene on each other. But this is probably just nomologically necessary. It depends on the specific laws of physics in our universe. It's totally conceivable that in some other universe with different laws, that connection wouldn't hold.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, we talked about the mind-body problem earlier and how supervenience plays a role there. Can you unpack that a bit more?
Yeah, it's a big one. Almost everyone in philosophy of mind these days, even those who lean towards dualism, they agree that mental stuff supervenes on physical stuff. But the big question is, what kind of necessity are we talking about?
Right, so that modal force again.
Exactly. Could you have a perfect physical copy of yourself, like a philosophical zombie, with absolutely no conscious experience?
Whoa, that's a wild thought.
Yeah.
So the whole zombie debate boils down to whether the mind-body link is something deeply necessary or just a super reliable pattern we happen to observe in our universe.
Exactly. If zombies are possible, then mental properties don't metaphysically supervene on physical properties, even if they always go together in our world. So yeah, that modal force really matters.
Okay, this is getting pretty deep. Let's switch gears a bit. You mentioned that supervenience is related to but different from other philosophical concepts, like entailment, right?
Yeah.
That one also has a sense of one thing leading to another.
Yeah, on the surface, they seem similar. They both have those properties of reflexivity, transitivity, and non-symmetry.
Wait, remind me what those are again.
So reflexivity means an A difference can't exist without an A difference. Kind of obvious, right?
Okay, yeah.
Transitivity means if A supervenes on B and B supervenes on C, then A supervenes on C. It's like a chain. And non-symmetry just means that even if A supervenes on B, it doesn't automatically mean that B supervenes on A. Kind of like the mental depends on the physical, but the physical doesn't depend on the mental.
Right, those do apply to both supervenience and entailment. But where do they differ? What's the big distinction?
Well, entailment, that's where the truth of one thing guarantees the truth of the other, like logically. But that's not always the case with supervenience. Take the example of being a brother. That entails being a sibling. But being a sibling doesn't supervene on being a brother. Someone can be a sibling without being a brother.
Right, like a sister. Okay, so you can have entailment without supervenience.
Exactly. And the other way around, too. Remember that nomological supervenience example, the thermal and electrical conductivity? They supervene on each other, but there's no logical entailment there. Thermal conductivity doesn't logically necessitate electrical conductivity.
Right. So even with that stronger metaphysical necessity, supervenience doesn't automatically imply entailment.
Not always. Take a negative property like not being F. The property being F totally supervenes on that metaphysically, but being F doesn't entail not being F.
Ah,
Or think about a conjunctive property like P and Q. It supervenes on the set of properties PQ. But neither P nor Q by itself entails P and Q.
So even when it's metaphysically necessary, the link between the base properties and the supervening property isn't always that direct, logically speaking.
Exactly. Now, if we're talking about property sets that are closed under those Boolean operations, negation, conjunction, disjunction, and underquantification, then the connection to entailment gets stronger. You can often find a combo of base properties that actually entails the supervening property, but assuming that kind of closure isn't always appropriate in philosophy.
Right, because the properties we're interested in might not always play so nicely together. Okay, next up, reduction. How does supervenience fit in with this big idea in metaphysics and philosophy of science?
Well, most philosophers agree that reduction requires supervenience. If you're going to say that one set of properties is reducible to another, then any difference at the higher level has to be reflected in the lower level.
Okay, so covariation is like the bare minimum for reduction.
Pretty much. But is it enough? Does supervenience guarantee reduction? That's where things get controversial. Most philosophers say no. Even if you have metaphysically necessary supervenience, it doesn't mean you've got a full-blown reduction. Because reduction, that's about identity, entailment, or even just the possibility of knowing the reduction a priori without any empirical observation. Supervenience doesn't give you that. You can have this tight connection, but not that deep explanatory connection that reduction aims for. It's not enough to just say that something's nothing over and above something else. Reduction wants more.
I see. So just because two things always go together doesn't mean one is just a fancy way of talking about the other in a deep explanatory sense. Now, the encyclopedia also mentioned this idea of ontological innocence, which seems pretty relevant to reduction.
Yeah, ontological innocence is all about whether this necessary connection implied by supervenience means that the A properties are, really nothing over and above the B properties, in terms of what exists.
So like in the forgery example, the
Mhm.
way the colors are arranged, it's just a consequence of the microphysical arrangement. It doesn't feel like an extra layer of reality.
Exactly. That's the supervenience intuition. Non-reductive physicalists, they argue that mental properties aren't the same as physical properties, but they're also not something extra because they supervene on the physical. Same with people who support unrestricted mereological composition, the idea that any collection of objects makes a new object. They say the composite object supervenes on its parts, so it's ontologically innocent.
But not everyone buys that, right?
Whoa, absolutely. The opposing view, the distinctness intuition, says that if A properties are really different from B properties, then they represent a further ontological commitment no matter how tight the link is. Critics of unrestricted mereology, they're not convinced that something like, a fusion of your shoe, the Eiffel Tower, and the number 7 is ontologically innocent. Even if its properties supervene on the properties of its weird parts, it feels like something more than just a random jumble.
So whether something is ontologically innocent isn't just a simple yes or no based on supervenience. It depends on what other philosophical baggage you're carrying. Now, grounding and ontological dependence, these seem like they get at a deeper because of relationship than just like things happening together.
You got it. Supervenience is mainly about describing a pattern of covariation. Grounding and dependence are about explanation. Grounding, as a metaphysical relation, is about something holding in virtue of something else. Ontological dependence is about the existence of one thing relying on the existence of another. They're trying to get at the why.
Okay, so supervenience tells us what goes with what, while grounding and dependence try to explain why.
Exactly. Different levels of analysis. Also, they apply to different things. Supervenience is usually about properties, while grounding can be about facts or entities, and dependence is usually about entities. Plus, their formal properties are different. Grounding and dependence are usually irreflexive, meaning nothing grounds itself, and asymmetrical, meaning if A grounds B, then B doesn't ground A, which is different from supervenience, which is reflexive and non-symmetrical. The key takeaway is that supervenience is weaker than grounding or dependence. Just because A can't change without B changing doesn't mean that B is the ultimate source of A, or that A needs B to exist.
Okay, that's a lot to unpack. Can you give me an example to make it more concrete?
Sure, remember that property F supervening on its negation, not F. They're always found together, but it doesn't make sense to say that being not F grounds being F, or that being F depends for its existence on being not F. And then there are those necessary properties, like being self-identical, or impossible ones, like being a square circle. They supervene on everything, but that doesn't mean your property of having a certain mass grounds the property of being self-identical. Supervenience there is just a trivial coincidence.
Okay, I see how supervenience is much less committal. Now, what about realization and emergence? Those come up a lot when people talk about complex systems like the mind.
Right. Realization, especially in the context of functionalism and philosophy of mind, it's a relationship between properties. One property realizes another if it plays the causal role that defines the second property. Like a certain pattern of neurons firing might realize the property of being in pain. There's also Shoemaker's subset view, which focuses on the subset relation between the causal powers of different properties. The main point is that realization is about how higher level properties are implemented by lower level structures that have specific causal powers.
So if one property realizes another, does that automatically mean there's supervenience between them?
Well, it seems like realization usually leads to supervenience, at least for the non-local kinds. If a particular physical state always causes pain, then differences in pain will probably match up with differences in that physical state. But it's not a two-way street. Supervenience doesn't mean realization. Those necessary and impossible properties, they supervene on everything, but they're not causally realized by anything.
Right, those are special cases.
And then there are epiphenomenal properties, the ones that don't have any causal powers. They can supervene on other properties without being realized in any functional sense.
Okay, that's tricky. Now, emergence, that's a term that has a lot of, well, philosophical baggage.
Yeah, for sure. Emergence has a long and complicated history. The British emergentists, like Broad, they thought emergent properties were these totally new properties of complex systems, ones you couldn't predict just by knowing the properties of the parts.
Okay.
Some philosophers today think this kind of emergence can be explained by nomological supervenience. So these emergent properties depend on the basic properties according to the laws of nature, but it's not metaphysically necessary, and they're not reducible to the basic properties either. The question is whether that weaker modal force and the irreducibility really sets emergence apart from other dependency relations, like realization, which might involve a tighter, even metaphysically necessary connection.
So, emergence might be a special kind of supervenience tied to the laws of our universe, and it involves a strong kind of irreducibility. Now, one last thing. How does supervenience connect to explanation itself? Because saying they can't be different doesn't really explain why they can't be different.
That's a key point. Supervenience claims are mostly descriptive. They tell you about patterns, how properties go together, but they don't usually explain why those properties are linked. A supervenience thesis can be true even if we have no clue how the dependency actually works.
So, like, we see a perfect correlation, but we're in the dark about the underlying mechanism.
Exactly. But many philosophers think that most interesting supervenience theses aren't just brute facts. There should be some explanation. And when a supervenience thesis is explainable, sometimes it's called superdupervenience.
Superdupervenience, huh?
Yeah. And the explanation can come from different places, like those cases of necessary or impossible properties supervening on anything. Those are explained by the nature of necessity and impossibility. They can't change, so they'll always go together with anything else.
Okay, so their own special logic explains it.
Right. And identity claims provide explanations too. The fact that water is H2O explains why you can't have a difference in one without a difference in the other. And, like we discussed earlier, nomological supervenience is often explained by laws of nature. The Wied von Franz law explains why electrical and thermal conductivity go together in metals. The point is, unexplained supervenience can be a bit unsatisfying, especially in areas like ethics, where the claim that moral properties depend on non-moral ones really needs a good justification.
Right. Okay, so we've laid down the foundation. Now, the encyclopedia gets into all the different types of supervenience. Sounds like the basic idea gets, well, refined to handle different philosophical problems.
Yeah, there are different flavors, you could say. That basic no A difference without a B difference can be made more precise depending on what we're talking about, individual things, possible worlds, how strong the cannot is. And this leads to different categories of supervenience. The main ones are individual supervenience, which focuses on, well, individual things, and global supervenience, which is all about whole possible worlds.
Okay, let's start with individual supervenience. What are the key distinctions there?
This is where Jae Kim comes in. He made the distinction between weak and strong individual supervenience. Weak individual supervenience says that in any single possible world, if two things are totally the same in their B properties, they have to be the same in their A properties too.
Okay, so if B matches, A matches.
But strong individual supervenience goes further. It says that across any two possible worlds, if two things are the same in their B properties, they got to be the same in their A properties.
So weak supervenience is just about one world, while strong supervenience is about all possible worlds.
Exactly. And strong supervenience implies weak supervenience, but not the other way around. Weak supervenience allows for the possibility that two things could be indiscernible, meaning they have all the same B properties, but still differ in their A properties if they're in different possible worlds.
Wait, so if they have the same B properties, why would they have different A properties just because they're in different worlds? That seems weird.
Right, it does seem counterintuitive. If the B properties determine the A properties in one world, why would that change in another world? That's the challenge with saying you have weak supervenience but not strong supervenience. You got to explain why different worlds can have different rules for how B maps onto A. It's like, why would there be a ban on mixing those rules within a world but not between worlds?
Yeah, you need a good reason for that. The encyclopedia had that example about asserting true propositions. Can you remind me how that works?
Sure. Imagine two people in the same world. They say the exact same things. They'll also be the same in terms of whether they've said something true, because the truth of what they said is fixed in that world. But imagine two people in different worlds saying the exact same things. One person might be in a world where most of what they said is true, while the other person is in a world where most of it is false. They said the same things, but one said more true things than the other. That's weak individual supervenience within each world. Same B means same A. But strong individual supervenience fails across worlds. Same B can mean different A.
Okay, so the truth or falsity of what they said, that's like the background condition that changes from world to world, and that messes up strong supervenience. But with something like the mind-body problem, it's harder to see what would allow for weak but not strong supervenience of the mental and the physical.
Exactly. That's why some philosophers, like Blackburn, have used this demand for explanation to criticize certain types of moral realism. If moral properties weakly supervene on non-moral properties, but not strongly, you need to explain why the moral facts seem tied to the non-moral facts within a world, but can vary across different possible worlds. It can't just be random.
Right, you can't be like, oh, in this world, stealing is wrong, but in that world, it's fine because of reasons.
Exactly. Now, the encyclopedia also mentioned that these modal operator versions of weak and strong supervenience, they sound like just different ways of saying the same thing as the possible worlds versions,
Right.
but they're actually stronger. They require not just that A and B go together across possibilities, but also that A properties are kind of necessarily entailed by some combo of B properties. And as we said before, supervenience in general doesn't guarantee that kind of logical link.
Especially if the set of base properties isn't well-behaved.
Exactly. So those examples we talked about, like F supervening on not F or P and Q supervening on P and Q separately, those show that the modal operator versions are stronger.
Right. Those showed covariation without the logical guarantee.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on to regional supervenience. That seems to be about, well, regions, not individual objects.
Yep. Terence Horgan came up with this idea. It's basically applying supervenience not to things, but to regions of space-time.
Okay.
And just like with individual supervenience, there are weak and strong versions. Weak regional supervenience says that in any world, if two regions are exactly the same in all their B properties, then they have to be the same in their A properties. Strong regional supervenience extends that to all possible worlds. So if a region in one world is a B duplicate of a region in another world, it's also got to be an A duplicate.
So same logic, but applied to, like, bigger chunks of reality.
Right. Horgan's idea was that regional supervenience can handle some dependencies that are hard to explain with just individual supervenience, like dependencies that involve holistic properties of a whole region.
Interesting. Now, global supervenience, that seems to be the biggest picture of all.
It is. Global supervenience is about the overall pattern of properties in a whole possible world. It says that if two worlds are totally indistinguishable in terms of their B properties, they have to be indistinguishable in terms of their A properties too.
So it's not about matching up individual things between worlds, but about whether the whole blueprint of reality is the same.
Exactly. And this is really useful for describing big philosophical views like physicalism, the idea that everything depends on the physical, or David Lewis's Humean supervenience, which says that all truths depend on the arrangement of matter in space and time.
Global supervenience seems like it would handle relational properties better than individual supervenience, right? Like being married to or being 5 feet away from. Those depend on more than just one thing.
Yeah, people often think that, and it's true that global supervenience can handle those relations easily. But actually, well-formulated individual supervenience can handle them too, by just including them in the sets of A or B properties. The real power of global supervenience is that it can deal with dependencies that come from the overall structure of the world, not just the properties of individual things.
Okay, so individual supervenience is about local dependencies, and global supervenience is about these bigger world-level constraints. Now, how do strong individual supervenience and global supervenience relate? Does one imply the other?
Strong individual supervenience actually does imply strong global supervenience. If any two things that are B indiscernible across worlds are also A indiscernible, then if two whole worlds are B indiscernible, meaning every individual in one has a matching counterpart in the other, then those worlds gotta be A indiscernible too. But the other way around, whether strong global supervenience implies strong individual supervenience, that's trickier.
I can imagine cases where the overall pattern matches, but the details don't line up perfectly between worlds.
That's exactly what some philosophers, like Patry, argued. They came up with thought experiments involving extrinsic supervenient properties. Those are properties that depend on things outside the individual that has them. And they used intrinsic base properties. The idea was to create worlds that were globally the same in terms of their intrinsic properties, but different in the distribution of those extrinsic properties.
So they were trying to break strong individual supervenience while keeping strong global supervenience intact. And what happened? Did other philosophers buy it?
Well, Paul and Sider objected. They said that those counterexamples were too focused on just two worlds. You got to consider all possible worlds. And they brought up these principles about isolated duplicates, individuals that exist in worlds where they're the only things with certain properties. They argued that those counterexamples would lead to contradictions if you considered all the possibilities. But then they came up with their own counterexample using an extrinsic supervenient property to show that global supervenience still doesn't guarantee strong individual supervenience. So the debate's been mostly about how extrinsic properties behave in supervenience relations.
So it seems like extrinsic properties, those that depend on things outside the individual,
Hmm.
are the key to separating global and individual supervenience.
Yeah, that's the main takeaway. Kim himself admitted that they don't always match up when you have extrinsic properties in the supervening set, and that's led to people looking at what happens when you restrict the types of properties involved, like by focusing on just intrinsic properties or by making sure the base set is rich enough to determine those extrinsic properties.
And what have they found?
Well, it turns out that if the base set is really rich, like specifically if it's closed under negation, conjunction, disjunction, quantification, and identity, all those logical operations, then strong global supervenience does entail strong individual supervenience.
So if you have all the logical tools you need in the base set, they match up.
Exactly. And if you limit yourself to just intrinsic properties, then a lot of the different types of supervenience we've talked about, they actually become equivalent. But it's worth noting that the weaker forms of global supervenience are still different from strong individual supervenience, even when you include extrinsic properties in the base set. So there's still a question about what those weaker global forms are good for.
Right. The encyclopedia mentioned this issue of intra-world variation with weak and intermediate global supervenience. What's that all about?
So, unlike strong global supervenience, which says that the B properties of a world totally determine the A properties, those weaker forms allow for cases where two things in the same world can have the same B properties, but different A properties. So the connection between B and A isn't as tight as it is with the stronger versions.
So if physicalism was based on weak global supervenience, you could have two physically identical people with different mental states.
Yeah, exactly. That's why strong global supervenience is the preferred way to describe physicalism using supervenience. If you go with weak or intermediate global supervenience, you have to explain why those weaker forms hold without implying the strong form, especially since they allow for these seemingly random variations within a world.
Okay, so we've covered individual and global supervenience. Now, the encyclopedia briefly mentioned something called similarity-based supervenience. That seems to be about degrees of difference, not just strict sameness.
Right. Instead of looking for exact matches, Similarity-based supervenience asks whether things that are not largely different in their B properties are also not largely different in their A properties.
So it's okay if there are small differences in the base properties, as long as the differences in the supervening properties are also small.
Yeah, that's the basic idea.
Yeah.
But importantly, similarity-based supervenience is totally separate from the indiscernibility-based supervenience we've been talking about.